What would happen to you if you were put in jail and sentenced to 27 years for a crime you didn't commit? Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and most honored guests, before I tell you that story about this gentleman, I want to share what happened to my wife and I in 2005. We went to Mexico, Rocky Point, and we fell in love with Rocky Point. In fact, the day we were there, we decided to buy a condo. 2 years later, in 2007, we finally moved into our condo, and our plan was to sit on the beach and drink margaritas. That was our plan. The following year, we had heard about an orphanage in Rocky Point, Mexico, with 41 children. And my wife and I and another couple decided to go visit these kids, just to see what was going on at the orphanage. It was about a 15-mile drive. When we got there, the kids were out in the courtyard, they were playing, they were having a wonderful time. But they also sat down for dinner. And that's when we noticed that all they had was a glass of milk, a little roll, and some butter. My wife walked up to the director and said, "Where's the vegetables, where's the meat?" And he says, "We only work on donations." And this particular week, we didn't have any donations. Well, my wife and I went to work at that point. With social media, we put the word out that the orphanage needed help. In fact, money started coming in, and we started buying food for this orphanage, to the point where it would be several $1,000s every time we would go there, which was every 4 to 6 weeks. But the neat part about this whole thing is that we got other churches involved. One up in Phoenix decided to buy them tires for their van, bought them a brand new stove, gave them $1,000 for food. So as my wife and I would go back to the orphanage every 4 to 6 weeks, we would see such an improvement there. The kids were happy. We would bring them shoes, we'd bring them blankets, we would bring them food. And over the last 10 years, these kids have grown up. And it's really touched our heart to see these kids. In fact, the kid standing up here, right above the one up in the white, is going to college, and we put him through college. This is some of the food. When we go down to Rocky Point, we go to the Sam's Club. They opened it up 2 years ago. So now we go to Sam's Club, we take the money that is donated to us, and we match dollar for dollar. In this case, we had over $1,000 for them to buy them food and cleaning supplies. Now let me take you back to the prison in Rocky Point. My wife and I were at a service in Rocky Point when we found out that the pastor that we knew ended up in prison. He got sentenced to a 4.5-year sentence. His name was Pastor Nacho. So we decided one day, let's go to the prison and see him. So we went to the prison, and they had an outdoor church service going on. And they gave my wife and I an opportunity to speak to the inmates. At that point, there was 400 inmates in this prison, and about 100 of them would show up for church service. Not speaking any Spanish, we had a translator. And I would talk to these people, and I would explain to them that at some point in your life, you will be getting out of prison. But I promise you, if you do something for somebody else when you get out, you'll be rewarded. We would go back every 4 to 6 weeks. In fact, we took Paul and his wife one time to experience what it's like to be inside this prison. We became very close with this guy in the orange here. Now, Pastor Nacho has been released from prison last year, and I was there the day he got released. But he brought up another person in prison, and his name is Antonio. And Antonio is the gentleman sitting in the orange, and his wife is right next to him. I've become very close to this guy, to the point when I found out that he had been in prison for 4 years and never been sentenced. As of last year, he was in there for 6 years. We decided to help the family. He's got 2 little girls. Now he's got 4 little girls. And every time we go there, we encourage him and we encourage the family to stay positive. In January of this year, I was able to buy him a cell phone. I got very close to the warden. The warden and I became very close, and I said to him one day, "Is there any way I could buy a cell phone for Antonio so we could talk daily?" And he said, "Absolutely. Give me $700 and then we have a phone." So I did that. I gave him $700 and bought him a phone. Antonio has a phone. I called him up in January and I said, "Antonio, I don't know where this date came from. It can only come from God, but I believe, and I want you to believe, that you will be out by September 15th of this year. So I said, not only do I believe you'll be out on September 15th, but I want you to tell the warden that you're going to get out September 15th. Now understand, he's got a 27-year sentence. The warden called up 3 weeks ago and said to Antonio, I want to see Tudor. So I drove to Rocky Point that same morning that he called. And I sat in front of that warden's desk and I said, Antonio will be out September 15th. And he looked at me like I was on drugs. And he said to Antonio, that's impossible, in Spanish. And Antonio replied, well, you don't know the God we know. I left that day, and that evening he called Antonio back in his office and he said, how does Tudor know this? And he said the same thing. Last week, Antonio's sentence was dismissed. A 27-year sentence dismissed. That does not happen in Mexico. In Mexico, you are guilty until you prove your innocence. I called up Antonio that day, and I said, is there any way I could talk to the warden again? And here's what he told me. He said, the warden said that since this time of the last 3 weeks, the fact that you're getting out, I'm going to start going to your church. This is Antonio. I gave him my sunglasses. He loved them. But this is now a church that was built inside the prison. Last year, Antonio came to me and said, I had this vision of building a church inside a federal prison in Mexico. And in fact, it took 6 months with a lot of donations. We put out the word, we need help building this church. This is actually one of the nicest churches in all of Rocky Point. In fact, the guards even go to church now. These 2 guards are part of the service. Every time they have church service, which is 3 times a week, these guys come to church. And it's really exciting because when you're there and you hear from these guys, their heart is poured out to you. They really share their life with you. And I've become very close to some of these inmates. We got a call about 3 months ago that a school here in Chandler was donating a tortilla machine. So I went down, looked at the tortilla machine. We ended up picking it up and transporting it down into Mexico. They named a tortilla factory after my stepdaughter that passed away in September of last year. It's called Nikki's Tortilla Factory. They now make tortillas every week for not only themselves, but they make it for the orphanage. They make it for the homeless right there in Rocky Point. So every Saturday, we get a truck to show up at the federal prison, pick up the tortillas, and take them to a homeless foundation that we started last year. We also had a couple donate a donut machine, so now they're making donuts inside the prison. The dynamics of this prison has totally changed, folks. It has gone from 400 inmates down to 110 inmates. These guys are getting out now and they're behaving themselves. They're not getting in trouble. They're loving life. In fact, most of them now are attending churches right inside Rocky Point. This is Antonio and his wife. We were able to give his wife some money and Antonio some money, and they allowed her to come into prison for 8 hours. I won't tell you what they did, but she ended up having twins. The twins now are 6 months old, and now our expenses have even gone up even more now because we're donating money, not only for the 2 kids she had, but now she's got 4. But you talk to Antonio today, and he will tell you that the last 6 years have been rough on him, but it's been the most rewarding for him. He's actually enjoying prison, and the reason he's enjoying prison is he's able to share his life with other inmates and give them hope. So when they get out, they have a little bit of peace and quiet with their family. We bought a van just a few months ago for his family. You can see his 2 daughters and the 2 twins down here. And there's a picture.